I am Richard Lawson, 73 years old and somehow still healing from wounds my own family inflicted. As a successful security contractor, I provided a rock-solid life for them, but maintained a quiet retirement after my wife passed away. Last Tuesday, I visited my daughter's fashion office to surprise her for her birthday. Between the glass walls and designer clothes, my son-in-law leaned forward screaming with absolute venom. You broke little rat. How dare you touch my stuff? I simply dropped my flowers and charged at him. That night, I logged into his corporate server, disabled his private security cameras, and called my old auditor about tracking his offshore accounts. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a monster who underestimated your worth. Growing up in the suburbs of Chicago meant hard work and grit. For 4 decades, I built heavy machinery-wired, secure corporate buildings and provided a safe haven for my late wife, Martha, and our only daughter, Maya. Our modest home was a fortress of love and protection. When Martha passed away 3 years ago, the silence became too loud to bear. I sold the property, downsized to an apartment, and handed Maya a check for $500,000. It was my entire life savings, given freely so she could launch her own independent fashion brand. She had just married Harrison Croft, a man who seemed like the American dream personified. He was the chief executive officer of his own family's corporate empire. He wore bespoke suits, drove a pristine sports car, and always treated me with the utmost respect. During the holidays, he would pour me a glass of aged scotch, look me dead in the eye, and promise that he would always protect my little girl. I believed him. I thought I could finally rest, knowing Maya was completely secure. But standing in that cold hall on her 34th birthday, listening to his vicious insults, I realized I had handed my daughter over to a predator. The air smelled of expensive perfume and fresh espresso, a stark contrast to the gritty construction sites I was used to. I expected smiles, maybe a quick lunch to celebrate. Instead, the sound shattered the elegant silence of the building. Through the cracked door of her private suite, I saw my beautiful daughter on her knees on the hardwood floor, sobbing uncontrollably. And when I looked up and saw Harrison standing over her, screaming at her like she was garbage, my blood turned to ice. I did not think. I simply reacted. The bouquet of lilies slipped from my hands, scattering white petals across the polished concrete floor. I shoved the heavy glass door open so hard it slammed against the drywall with a deafening crack. A spider web of fractures spread across the frosted glass, but I did not care. Harrison whipped around, his face contorted in rage, but the moment he saw me, his expression faltered. He did not have time to put his charming mask back on. I crossed the room in 3 massive strides. I might be 73, but 40 years of hauling steel cables and climbing scaffolding does not just vanish from your bones. I grabbed him by the lapels of his expensive Italian suit and slammed him backward against a tall metal filing cabinet. The steel dented loudly under his weight. I pinned him there, my forearm pressing hard against his collarbone, cutting off his air supply. My free fist was pulled back, trembling with the sheer force of my anger. I wanted to break his jaw. I wanted to smash that arrogant, cruel face until he understood exactly what it meant to terrify my child. He gasped, his eyes wide with genuine panic, raising his manicured hands in a desperate attempt to protect himself. "Richard," he choked out, his voice a pathetic squeak compared to the vicious roar I had heard seconds ago. "Richard, wait, please." I tightened my grip, leaning in so close he could smell the black coffee on my breath. "If you ever speak to her like that again," I whispered, my voice a low, dangerous gravel, "I will make sure they never find your body." Before I could deliver the crushing blow, a pair of frantic arms wrapped tightly around my waist. "Dad, stop. Please, Dad, let him go. You do not understand." It was Maya. She was pulling at my heavy jacket, her face streaked with ruined mascara, her breathing ragged and desperate. I looked down at her, entirely confused and heartbroken. Why was she defending the man who had just deeply humiliated her? I slowly released my iron grip, stepping back and letting Harrison slide down the cabinet. He immediately adjusted his crooked tie, clearing his throat, and the psychological transformation was instantaneous. It was genuinely terrifying to witness how quickly he could switch his emotions on and off like a light switch. The terrified coward vanished, replaced entirely by the smooth, polished corporate executive. He ran a trembling hand through his perfectly styled hair and let out a long, exhausted sigh, rubbing his temples as if he were carrying the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. "Dad, I am so incredibly sorry," Harrison said, his voice dropping into a tone of deep manufactured regret. "I lost my temper. I am under an unimaginable amount of financial stress right now, but there is absolutely no excuse for what I just said to your daughter." Maya quickly stepped between us, acting as his physical shield. "Dad, it is my fault," she cried, wiping her eyes frantically. "I messed up. I made a catastrophic inventory error with our overseas fabric supplier. I accidentally ruined a $2 million shipment for the company. Everything I have worked for over the last 3 years is about to be completely wiped out. We are facing total bankruptcy because of my stupid mistake. Harrison has been working 80-hour weeks, secretly liquidating his own family trust fund just to cover my massive error and keep my brand afloat. He is just breaking under the intense pressure of fixing my mess. Please do not hurt him. He is saving us." I stood there in the center of the lavish office, breathing heavily, looking back and forth between them. Maya was physically trembling, looking at Harrison with a toxic mixture of profound guilt and desperate gratitude. She truly believed she had destroyed their lives and that he was her ultimate selfless savior. Harrison looked back at me with those perfectly calm, sympathetic eyes, nodding sadly, as if asking for my fatherly understanding. It was the perfect, plausible lie. It neatly explained the yelling, it justified the extreme tension, and it manipulated the narrative to make him look like a stressed martyr rather than an abusive monster. But deep down in my gut, a silent alarm began to ring. A man who truly loves his wife does not call her a broke little rat, no matter how much money is lost. He does not look at her with such profound disgust. He does not reduce her to nothing. I slowly lowered my hands to my sides, hiding my clenched fists. I smoothed my own jacket and took a deliberate step back toward the door. "I am going to leave now," I said, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion, masking the storm brewing inside my mind. "But we are going to talk about this later." I bent down, picked up the crushed bouquet of lilies from the floor, and set them gently on her sleek glass desk. "Happy birthday, sweetheart." I turned around and walked out of the building. I accepted his excuse for now, but my intuition screamed that this was only the tip of a very dark, dangerous iceberg. I was going to find out the truth. The heavy glass doors of the Fashion District building closed behind me, cutting off the sterile, perfectly conditioned air of Harrison Croft's corporate world. I stood on the bustling Chicago sidewalk, the cold wind whipping against my jacket, and for a moment I could not remember how to breathe. The adrenaline that had surged through my 73-year-old veins was beginning to evaporate, leaving behind a profound aching exhaustion in my bones. My knuckles were still white, my hands trembling slightly as I shoved them deep into my pockets. I walked blindly toward where I had parked my truck, the sounds of city traffic washing over me like static. I could not get the image out of my head. My daughter, my brilliant, strong Maya reduced to a weeping mess on the floor, frantically defending the man who had just called her a broke little rat. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Harrison had always presented himself as the ultimate gentleman. I was the kind of man who opened car doors, who pulled out chairs, who spoke in measured, soothing tones about market synergy and corporate philanthropy. Yet in that fraction of a second, before he realized I was standing in the doorway, the mask had completely slipped. I saw the real Harrison Croft. I saw a predator who enjoyed the absolute terror in his wife's eyes. When I climbed into the cab of my truck, I did not start the engine right away. I gripped the worn leather steering wheel and replayed his excuse in my mind. The plausible lie. He claimed Maya had made a catastrophic inventory error with an overseas fabric supplier, costing Croft Enterprises $2 million. He claimed he was secretly liquidating his own family trust fund to cover her mistake and save her fashion brand from total bankruptcy. He painted a picture of a desperate, loving husband buckling under the immense pressure of financial ruin. It was a perfectly constructed narrative designed to make Maya feel entirely responsible and eternally grateful. But I spent 40 years running heavy construction projects and dealing with international supply chains. You do not just accidentally ruin a $2 million shipment without a massive paper trail, multiple layers of corporate approval, and a dozen insurance safeguards kicking in automatically. It simply does not happen that way. A company like Croft Enterprises would have risk management protocols that would catch a supplier error long before it threatened to bankrupt a subsidiary brand. The math did not add up. The logistics did not make sense. And more importantly, a man who is liquidating his assets to save his wife out of love does not scream at her with such visceral hatred. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life with a familiar, comforting rumble. As I drove away from the towering skyscrapers and headed back toward the quiet suburbs, my thoughts drifted to my late wife, Martha. She had been the emotional anchor of our family. When she died of cancer 3 years ago, it felt like the very foundation of my world had been ripped away. Maya was completely devastated. She had always dreamed of starting her own independent clothing line, but she had put everything on hold to help me care for her mother during those final, agonizing months. After Martha's funeral, I knew I could not stay in our big, empty house. Every room held a memory that hurt too much to look at. So I sold the property we had lived in for 30 years. I downsized to a modest apartment, and I took $500,000 from the sale to give to Maya. It was my entire life savings. I handed her that check so she could finally chase her dream without ever needing to rely on anyone else. She used that money to launch her brand, and shortly after, she married Harrison. I thought the money would be her ultimate safety net. Now I was terrified it had been a shiny lure that attracted a shark. By the time I parked in my driveway, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the neighborhood. I sat in my living room with a cup of black coffee, the house utterly silent around me. I could not just accuse Harrison without proof. He was wealthy, well-connected, and clearly manipulative enough to turn Maya completely against me if I pushed too hard without solid evidence. I needed to test him. I needed to see how he reacted under pressure when he thought he was in control. I picked up my phone and sent a simple text message to Maya, inviting them both to a high-end steakhouse downtown for dinner that upcoming Friday. I framed it as an apology. I wrote that I felt terrible about walking in on a stressful business moment, and I wanted to treat them to a nice meal to clear the air. Less than 5 minutes later, Harrison replied from Maya's phone. He said they would absolutely love to come, and that he was eager to put the misunderstanding behind us. I was too eager. A normal man would be deeply embarrassed or defensive after being caught humiliating his wife. Harrison was completely unfazed. Friday evening arrived with a bitter chill in the air. I secured a private corner booth at the steakhouse, arriving 20 minutes early to observe them walking in. I wanted to see their dynamic before they realized I was watching. Through the large glass windows at the front of the restaurant, I spotted Harrison's sleek black sports car pulling up to the valet stand. Harrison stepped out first, adjusting his pristine tailored suit. He walked around to the passenger side, but he did not open the door for Maya. He just stood there checking his reflection in the tinted window until she pushed the heavy door open herself. She looked exhausted. Her shoulders were slightly slumped, and she was clutching her designer purse tightly against her chest. As they approached the entrance, Harrison suddenly reached out and placed a firm hand on the back of her neck. From a distance, it might have looked like an affectionate gesture between a husband and wife, but from my vantage point, I saw Maya's entire body tense up. She physically flinched, her eyes dropping to the pavement, as he leaned in and whispered something cold into her ear before forcing a perfectly bright artificial smile for the hostess. I just remained completely still in the dark corner booth, quietly watching my daughter walk toward me like a prisoner marching to the gallows. She wore a stunning black dress, but the expensive fabric hung loosely on her frame, highlighting just how much weight she had lost recently. Harrison guided her slowly through the crowded restaurant, his hand resting heavily on the small of her back. It was a very clear, calculated display of total possession. They finally reached my table, and Harrison immediately extended his hand toward me, his face glowing with a manufactured, brilliant warmth. "Good evening, Richard," he said very smoothly. "Thank you so very much for the wonderful invitation." I did not take his outstretched hand. I simply gestured toward the plush leather seats of the booth. "Sit down, Harrison," I said, keeping my voice devoid of the hostility boiling inside my chest. He dropped his hand, sliding into the booth next to Maya with manufactured grace. I ordered drinks and leaned back, letting the ambient noise of the steakhouse wash over us. This was my element. In 40 years of negotiating security contracts, I had sat across from mobsters posing as businessmen and politicians hiding dark secrets. I knew how to read a room, and I knew how to read a man hiding something. As the waiter brought our iced water glasses, I took a deliberate look at my daughter. She sat rigidly against the upholstery. That was when my contractor's eye caught the first glaring inconsistency. Maya had placed her designer purse on the empty seat beside her. It was supposed to be an exclusive luxury bag. Harrison had proudly presented it to her last Christmas, boasting about the wait list. But as the restaurant lighting caught the edges, I noticed severe fraying. The stitching near the gold clasp was unraveling, and the synthetic material was peeling in a way genuine craftsmanship never would. It was a cheap knockoff. My daughter, the chief executive officer of a thriving brand, carried a counterfeit bag. I shifted my gaze to the man sitting beside her. Harrison reached up to adjust his crisp shirt collar, and the movement pulled back his suit cuff, exposing his wrist. Fastened, there was a brand new, shining luxury watch. I know precision engineering. That timepiece was a masterclass in modern luxury, easily worth $40,000. It caught the light perfectly, a glaring beacon of immense wealth. The cognitive dissonance struck me harder this time. Why was the husband, who claimed to be secretly liquidating his family trust fund to save his wife from bankruptcy, wearing a new luxury watch, while his wife carried a fraying counterfeit purse? The financial narrative he spun was unraveling right in front of my eyes. Our thick premium steaks arrived sizzling loudly on hot porcelain plates. The smell of roasted garlic filled the air, but no one at the table seemed genuinely hungry. Maya pushed asparagus around her plate with her fork, her hands visibly shaking. "Eat something, sweetheart," I said softly, trying to inject warmth into this miserable performance. She offered a weak smile and took a tiny bite. Harrison was cutting into his prime rib with precision, perfectly at ease. He began talking about a recent charity golf tournament, casually name-dropping local politicians and real estate developers. He was putting on a show, trying to assert dominance over the conversation, ignoring the fact that his wife looked exactly like a terrified hostage. That was when he made his move. He paused. His story wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and turned to Maya. He reached out, placing his large hand firmly on her bare shoulder. The reaction was instantaneous and horrifying. Maya did not just tense up. Her entire body violently flinched away from his sudden touch, a visceral, involuntary physical response. She immediately tried to cover up by reaching for her water glass. She was absolutely terrified of him. A man who truly loves his wife, a man sacrificing his own wealth to save her business, does not elicit that kind of bone-deep terror. He does not call her a broke little rat when he thinks no one is listening. I knew that my daughter was in grave danger. It was finally time to spring the delicate trap. I set my fork down, took a slow sip of my red wine, and locked eyes directly with Harrison. I have been thinking a lot about what happened in the office on Tuesday. I began letting my voice carry a tone of deep fatherly concern. I hate seeing my little girl under so much stress, and I truly hate knowing you are bearing the brunt of this financial burden entirely alone, Harrison. You are family now, and family protects each other." Harrison smiled, offering a slick, practiced expression of gratitude. "That means the absolute world to me, Richard. We are handling it, I promise you. It is just a temporary cash flow crisis. We will weather this storm together." I leaned forward, resting my forearms firmly on the table, invading his personal space just enough to make him slightly uncomfortable. "I want to help," I said smoothly. "I spent my entire life building a safety net, and I am not going to sit by and watch you two lose absolutely everything over a single inventory mistake. I have $200,000 sitting in a liquid retirement fund right now. I want to transfer it to the company by the end of the week to help cover the immediate supplier debts." Maya audibly gasped, her eyes widening in pure shock. "Dad, no, you absolutely cannot do that. That is your retirement money. You worked your whole life for that." Harrison, however, did not immediately refuse the offer. I saw the sharp, predatory calculation flash across his eyes. It was a terrifying micro-expression, a fleeting moment of pure greed before he quickly masked it with feigned humility. "Richard, that is incredibly generous," he said, his voice dropping into a manufactured register of profound respect. "I do not even know what to say right now. That capital injection would completely stabilize our logistics chain. I can quickly draft a repayment agreement with 5% interest. You have my solemn word that you will be fully paid back within the year." I smiled, keeping my facial expression warm, while the blood in my veins ran absolutely cold. He was entirely eager to take my money. "But here is the condition." I continued, my tone shifting instantly from fatherly concern to strictly business. "My entire life I have operated on a strict, unyielding policy of due diligence before investing any capital. It is just an old contractor habit I simply cannot break. Before I wire the $200,000, I need my old corporate accountant to spend a few hours looking over the company ledger. He just needs to personally verify the current debt structure and ensure the funds are allocated directly to the overseas supplier. It is a standard procedure, strictly a minor formality." The silence that fell over the leather booth was heavier than lead. The lively atmosphere in the crowded restaurant seemed to vanish entirely, leaving only the three of us isolated in a vacuum of sudden, suffocating tension. Harrison stopped chewing his steak. The slick, confident smile completely slid off his handsome face, replaced instantly by a rigid, entirely hollow stare. I calmly watched the frantic pulse flutter rapidly in his neck. His knuckles turned stark white as he slowly gripped his heavy steak knife. Maya looked absolutely terrified, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid, her fearful eyes darting frantically between my calm face and Harrison's rigid profile. I had just backed a cornered, dangerous predator into a solid wall, and I was fully prepared to watch him bare his teeth. For several long, agonizing seconds, the only sound at our table was the clinking of silverware from the surrounding diners and the soft jazz playing through the overhead speakers. Harrison slowly set his heavy steak knife down on the porcelain plate. The metallic clatter seemed to echo loudly in the sudden vacuum of our conversation. When he finally looked up at me, the charismatic, charming son-in-law was entirely gone. His eyes were flat, cold, and utterly devoid of humanity. The carefully constructed facade had completely shattered, revealing the absolute arrogance and malice underneath. "Are you actually serious right now?" Richard Harrison asked, his voice dropping into a low, venomous whisper that barely carried across the polished table. "You invite me to dinner under the guise of a family apology, and then you try to corner me with a financial audit. Do you honestly think I am going to let some retired blue-collar construction worker bring an outside accountant to dig through my complex corporate ledgers?" His words dripped with profound condescension. He was purposefully trying to make me feel small, attempting to exert his perceived class superiority over a man who had spent 40 years wearing steel-toed boots and breathing in concrete dust. He wanted me to react emotionally, to cause a scene that would validate his narrative of me being an unstable, overbearing father. I kept my face entirely impassive, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. "It is standard protocol, Harrison," I replied evenly, keeping my hands resting casually on the table to show I was not intimidated. $200,000 is a significant amount of capital. I worked my entire life for that money, bleeding and sweating on construction sites so my family could have a future. Any legitimate businessman would welcome an independent review to ensure the funds are routed correctly. If the debt to the overseas supplier is exactly what you say it is, then my accountant will verify it in a matter of hours, and the money will be wired to your account by tomorrow morning. What exactly is the problem? Harrison leaned forward, invading my personal space. His jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles twitching fiercely beneath his skin. "The problem, Richard, is your staggering disrespect," he hissed, completely dropping any remaining pretense of politeness. "I run a multinational corporate portfolio. I manage tens of millions of dollars in liquid assets every single quarter. I do not need a man who spent his life laying brick and pulling copper wire to question my modern corporate finance strategies. You have absolutely no idea how high-level logistics or agile equity operates. This is not some local hardware store. This is the big leagues, and you are entirely out of your depth." Before I could firmly put him in his place and remind him whose money he was so desperate to take, Maya suddenly intervened. She lunged forward, her hands desperately grabbing the edge of the heavy wooden table. "Dad, please just stop it," she pleaded, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. She looked at me with eyes so full of manufactured guilt and terror that it physically broke my heart. "You are completely embarrassing us. Harrison is right. You do not understand how corporate liquidity vectors work. The brand is highly leveraged right now because we are transitioning to an agile equity model. The inventory mistake was entirely my fault, and Harrison is the only one who knows how to restructure the holding accounts to save us." I sat there, stunned into absolute silence, listening to my beautiful, intelligent daughter parrot a string of meaningless corporate buzzwords she clearly did not understand. Harrison had systematically brainwashed her. He had fed her a strict script of complex financial jargon to make her feel completely incompetent and entirely dependent on his supposed genius. I had convinced her that she was a massive liability, and that he was the only person capable of translating the complex business world for her. "Dad, you cannot bring an outside accountant into this," Maya continued, tears welling up in her eyes and spilling over her cheeks. "It would trigger a catastrophic breach of contract with our primary lenders. It would violate the strict non-disclosure agreements I signed when we merged the supply chain. If you bring someone in to audit the books, you will trigger an immediate default, and we will lose everything instantly. Just please withdraw the offer. We do not need your money. Harrison is going to fix my mistake. I am so sorry, Harrison. I am so sorry he is doing this to you." She turned to her abuser, actively apologizing to the man who was actively destroying her mind and her spirit. Harrison leaned back in the luxurious leather booth, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at me with a triumphant, malicious smirk. He had completely won this battle, and he knew it. He had expertly weaponized my own daughter against me, using her profound fear and manufactured guilt to build an impenetrable wall around his secrets. In that terrible, freezing moment, my intuition crystallized into absolute certainty. This was the classic textbook behavior of a severe psychological abuser. Harrison was systematically isolating her. He was cutting off her access to outside help, alienating her from her family, and convincing her that any external intervention would lead to total catastrophe. If I pushed back right now, if I demanded the audit and exposed his hostility, Harrison would simply paint me as the aggressive, controlling father who was trying to ruin her marriage and her business. He would force Maya to cut all contact with me, framing it as a necessary step to protect their future, and I would lose my daughter entirely. I needed to tactically retreat. I needed him to believe that I was just a foolish, overstepping old man who had been thoroughly put in his place. I slowly lowered my head, staring at the white linen tablecloth. I let out a long, defeated sigh, slumping my shoulders to project total submission. "You know what, Maya," I said, making my voice sound appropriately tired and deeply remorseful. "You are right. I am sorry." I looked up at Harrison, forcing myself to swallow every ounce of my pride and temper my simmering rage. "Harrison, I sincerely apologize. I spent too many years running a small local contracting business, and I let my old stubborn habits get the better of me. I do not understand modern corporate finance, and it was incredibly presumptuous of me to demand an audit of your complex operations. I was just worried about my little girl, but I clearly overstepped my bounds. Please, forgive me for being so foolish." Harrison stared at me for a long moment, his dark eyes aggressively searching my weathered face for any sign of deception. Satisfied by my apparent defeat and physical submission, his cruel smirk widened into a deeply patronizing smile. He reached out and magnanimously patted my hand on the table. "It takes a big man to admit when he is utterly out of his depth, Richard," he said smoothly. "Apology accepted. We will keep this strictly as a family matter. No outside interference. Maya and I have it completely under control." The rest of the dinner was a miserable, suffocating performance. I chewed my expensive steak, forcing myself to smile and nod, as Harrison held court talking endlessly about his brilliant corporate maneuvers. Maya remained quiet, visibly relieved that the conflict had been diffused, but still casting nervous, deferential glances at her husband. When the bill finally arrived, I paid in full, shaking Harrison's hand outside the restaurant as we parted ways. I watched his black sports car speed off into the chilly Chicago night. I stood alone on the pavement, my blood simmering with a cold, relentless focus. Harrison thought he had successfully neutralized the threat. He thought he had intimidated the old blue-collar worker into total submission. But he had made a fatal miscalculation. I had underestimated a man who spent 40 years securing vulnerabilities and unearthing hidden flaws. My retreat was not a surrender. It was the absolute beginning of a war. The next morning, I woke up long before the sun crested over the suburban horizon. The air in my modest apartment was still and quiet, carrying the faint chill of an impending Midwestern storm. I brewed a pot of strong black coffee, carried my heavy ceramic mug to the small wooden desk in the corner of my living room, and booted up my old but highly reliable computer. My mind was sharp, focused entirely on the glaring inconsistencies from the night before. Harrison had been absolutely terrified of an independent audit. He had hidden behind a manufactured wall of fake corporate jargon and weaponized non-disclosure agreements to keep my money away from scrutiny. If the fashion brand was truly just struggling from a simple inventory mistake, an audit would be a minor inconvenience, not a catastrophic threat. There was something deeply fundamentally wrong with the financial structure of that company, and I was going to find out exactly what it was. I opened my web browser and navigated directly to the Illinois Secretary of State, Official Business, and Limited Liability Company database. This was public record. Anyone with enough patience and the exact name of a business could access the foundational corporate filings. I had spent decades pulling municipal permits, checking contractor licenses, and verifying corporate entities before signing massive construction deals. I knew exactly how to trace a paper trail and bypass corporate smokescreens. I typed in the official registered name of Maya's fashion brand, the company she had proudly launched 3 years ago with my life savings. The search engine hummed for a few seconds before generating a list of results. I clicked on the primary entity file, bringing up the annual reports and the original articles of organization. I took a slow sip of my coffee, my eyes scanning the dense columns of legal text, looking for the managing members and the primary executive officers. I scrolled down the page, and then I completely froze. I read the section once. I read it twice. My heart began to pound, a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs, echoing loudly in the silent room. Maya's name was absolutely nowhere on the official documents. She was not listed as the founder. She was not listed as the chief executive officer. She was not listed as a managing member or even a minority shareholder. According to the state of Illinois, my daughter had absolutely zero ownership of the company. She had poured her heart, her soul, and her relentless 80-hour work weeks into. Instead, the fashion brand was registered as a wholly owned subsidiary. It was 100% owned by a shadowy corporate entity listed only as a limited liability holding group. My hands began to tremble with a volatile mixture of profound shock and rising fury. I quickly copied the name of the holding group and pasted it into a new search query. I dug into the registered agent history, cross-referencing the corporate addresses listed on the tax forms. It took me less than 20 minutes to follow the tangled web of shell companies. The holding group that owned Maya's brand traced directly back to a parent corporation. That parent corporation was Croft Enterprises. Harrison owned everything. He had legally isolated Maya from her own creation, turning her into nothing more than an unpaid, glorified employee who possessed zero actual equity. He had effectively stolen the entire company out from under her feet without her even realizing it. But the sheer horror of the situation did not stop there. I needed to know exactly what happened to my money. 3 years ago, I had authorized a direct wire transfer of $500,000 to help Maya secure her initial commercial lease and purchase her starting inventory. I opened the bottom drawer of my heavy wooden desk and pulled out a thick, dusty manila folder containing my old financial records. I frantically sifted through the papers until I found the specific bank statement from 3 years ago, locating the exact routing and account numbers where the massive wire transfer had been sent. I looked closely at the receiving account details. At the time, Maya had given me the banking information, joyfully telling me it was the new primary operational account for her brand. But as I cross-referenced those specific routing numbers with the corporate filings currently displayed on my computer screen, the final devastating piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The account that received my entire life savings was not an operational business account for a fashion startup. It was a private offshore holding account explicitly linked to Harrison's parent corporation. The $500,000 had never gone toward dresses or premium fabrics or commercial leases. It had never touched Maya's actual business operations for a single second. The exact moment I authorized the transfer, Harrison had instantly swept the entire $500,000 into his own offshore accounts. The fashion brand was a total financial ghost town. It was an elaborate, beautifully decorated prop designed entirely to keep Maya distracted and exhausted, while Harrison successfully siphoned away my money and legally owned every single physical asset. I leaned back in my wooden desk chair, the cold coffee sitting, forgotten, on the desk. The sheer magnitude of the deception was absolutely paralyzing. Harrison had not just stolen my money. He had systematically stolen my daughter's identity, her dreams, and her legal rights, trapping her in a labyrinth of corporate fraud while deliberately convincing her that she was entirely responsible for a financial crisis that he had orchestrated. Maya was taking all the emotional blame, suffering immense psychological abuse, and actively begging for forgiveness for a company that was meticulously designed from the very beginning to be a financial black hole. My daughter was isolated, deeply brainwashed, and legally tethered to a monster who viewed us as nothing more than an endless stream of revenue. I reached out and slowly closed my laptop, the screen going pitch dark. The time for passive observation was completely over. It was time to hunt. The following morning, I invited Maya and Harrison to my apartment for a casual Sunday brunch. I needed to execute my new plan flawlessly. To catch a corporate predator of Harrison's caliber, you cannot simply confront him with accusations. You must give him enough slack in the rope to hang himself. I knew perfectly well that as long as I was physically hovering around Chicago, asking probing questions and watching his every single move, Harrison would keep his heavy guard up. He would maintain his polished corporate facade and keep Maya tightly controlled under his thumb. I needed to completely remove myself from the board. I needed him to believe that he had thoroughly defeated me at the steakhouse, and that I was retreating into quiet retirement with my tail tucked firmly between my legs. When they arrived at my apartment, I had fresh black coffee brewing and a warm, welcoming smile plastered securely on my face. We sat together at my small wooden dining table, and I made my calculated announcement. I told them that the high tension of the past few weeks had taken a significant toll on my physical health. I said I desperately needed to clear my head, get far away from the bustling city, and spend some serious time off the grid. I informed them I was planning a 2-week solo fishing trip down to the remote waters of the Florida Keys. I heavily emphasized that I would be leaving my primary cell phone powered down and locked in a safe for the vast majority of the trip, so I could genuinely disconnect from the modern world and find some peace. The reaction I received from my son-in-law was immediate and deeply unsettling. Maya looked genuinely relieved, clearly hoping this long trip would cure my sudden paranoia and permanently restore the domestic peace in our fractured family. But Harrison's reaction was something else entirely. His dark eyes lit up with an intense, almost predatory excitement that he could barely contain. He leaned eagerly across the table, his charming manufactured smile returning in full blinding force, and immediately insisted on taking over all the logistics for my vacation. He said that since I had been so incredibly generous with my financial offers recently, he wanted to personally treat me to the ultimate uninterrupted getaway. Before I could even politely decline his offer, he already had his expensive smartphone out and was rapidly tapping the glass screen. He insisted on booking me a premium private deep-sea boat rental package. He told me he knew an exclusive charter company down in the Keys that offered extended solitary excursions out into the deep, isolated waters of the Gulf of Mexico. He paid for the entire luxury package right there at my dining table without batting an eye. He was overly thrilled, practically vibrating with a sudden, manic energy. As I watched him finalize the non-refundable booking, a cold, creeping chill washed over my entire body. My old security contractor instincts flared to absolute life. Harrison was not just buying me a generous vacation. He was meticulously ensuring that I would be thousands of miles away, isolated on the open ocean, completely unreachable and utterly irrelevant, for 14 consecutive days. He needed me completely out of the picture, with absolute certainty. The sheer desperation he showed to get me on that specific boat was a massive blaring red flag, signaling loud and clear that his endgame for my daughter's fashion brand was rapidly approaching. 3 days later, I systematically packed my heavy canvas duffel bag with everything I would need. I hugged Maya tightly in my driveway, kissing the top of her head and promising her that everything would be perfectly fine when I returned from my long voyage. Harrison shook my hand firmly, his grip strong and overly enthusiastic, wishing me a truly wonderful and relaxing time on the water. I climbed into the cab of my reliable old truck and drove straight toward O'Hare International Airport. I followed the standard commuter route, navigating carefully through the heavy morning traffic and pulling directly into the massive concrete long-term parking structure. I grabbed my duffel bag, locked the heavy doors of my truck, and walked briskly toward the bustling airport terminals. But the exact moment I merged into the dense, chaotic crowds of hurrying travelers, I simply kept walking. I bypassed the busy ticketing counters entirely. I did not check any luggage at the kiosks. I did not even glance at the long security checkpoints. Instead, I walked straight down the corridors to the underground transit station and quickly boarded a commuter train, heading far away from the airport. I rode the rattling train for over an hour, sitting quietly in the back corner and watching the glittering Chicago skyline slowly fade into the gritty, neglected industrial outskirts of the city. I stepped off the train in a rundown, quiet neighborhood that wealthy corporate tourists never visit. I carried my heavy bag down a cracked, weed-filled sidewalk until I finally found exactly what I was looking for. It was a dingy, faded motel situated right next to an old, rusting freight train yard. The broken neon sign out front was buzzing loudly and missing half of its glowing letters. I walked into the cramped, poorly lit lobby and paid for 2 full weeks in advance using crisp, untraceable cash. It cost me exactly $40 a night. The small room smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke and harsh chemical floor cleaners, but I did not care about the lack of luxury. It was entirely off the grid, and no one in the world knew I was there. I dropped my canvas bag onto the sagging mattress and immediately headed back out to a local rundown electronics store. I paid cash for a cheap prepaid burner phone and a very basic untraceable laptop computer. Then I visited a dusty industrial supply shop to purchase a highly specialized set of tactical tools. I bought precision micro screwdrivers, heavy wire strippers, thick insulated gloves, and a heavy-duty tactical flashlight. Finally, from a specialized private security vendor I had known personally for decades, I acquired the most crucial items for my upcoming mission. I bought 3 military-grade micro-audio recorders and a high-definition wide-angle pinhole camera, all small enough to easily fit hidden in the palm of my hand. I returned to my dingy motel room just as the setting sun dipped completely below the horizon, plunging the city into darkness. I carefully laid all my new equipment out on the small, scratched wooden desk by the window. I was no longer just a retired old man taking a peaceful, relaxing fishing trip in sunny Florida. I was a relentless ghost operating silently in the dark shadows of Chicago. My son-in-law Harrison Croft mistakenly thought he had completely eliminated the only remaining threat to his massive corporate fraud, but he had simply given me the perfect, unquestionable cover to meticulously dismantle his entire life. At exactly 2 a.m, I stepped out of my dingy motel room and into the freezing Chicago air. The city was completely asleep, blanketed in a thick, oppressive darkness that perfectly suited my needs. I wore dark, unremarkable clothing, a heavy black jacket, and a plain baseball cap pulled low over my face. My tactical tools and the surveillance equipment were securely packed into a small, inconspicuous canvas messenger bag slung across my chest. I did not take the commuter train back into the city. That would leave a digital footprint on a transit card or a security camera at the station. Instead, I had paid a local mechanic entirely in cash to rent his battered, unregistered delivery van for a few hours. The engine sputtered and coughed as I navigated the desolate suburban streets, but it was virtually invisible to the automated license plate readers monitoring the downtown expressways. I parked the rusty van in a dimly lit narrow alleyway 2 blocks away from the towering glass structure that housed my daughter's fashion brand. The wind howled violently between the skyscrapers, biting at my exposed skin, but my hands were completely steady. I walked briskly, keeping my head down and hugging the deep shadows cast by the massive concrete buildings. When I reached the sleek, polished glass entrance of Croft Enterprises, I paused in the blind spot of the exterior security cameras. I knew exactly where those blind spots were. Over my 40-year career as a commercial security contractor, I had personally designed and installed hundreds of surveillance grids exactly like this one. I knew their overlapping angles, their refresh rates, and most importantly, I knew their inherent weaknesses. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a plain white magnetic keycard. Maya had given it to me over a year ago, back when she still possessed a shred of independence. She told me it was a master access card for building emergencies, a gesture of absolute trust from a daughter to her father. Harrison clearly did not know I possessed it, or he would have undoubtedly deactivated it the moment he began his systematic isolation of her. I took a slow, deep breath, pressed the magnetic card flat against the glowing proximity reader, and waited for the terrifying fraction of a second. A soft green light flashed, followed instantly by the heavy, satisfying click of the electronic deadbolt releasing. I pushed the heavy glass door open and slipped silently into the expansive marble lobby. The vast ground floor was completely deserted, illuminated only by the harsh, sterile glow of the emergency exit signs. The overnight security guard was stationed behind a massive curved desk on the far side of the lobby, completely absorbed in a glowing tablet screen. I did not panic. I simply dropped into a low crouch utilizing the shadows cast by a row of tall, decorative indoor plants. I moved with the practiced silent precision of a ghost, keeping my heavy footsteps perfectly synchronized with the low rhythmic hum of the massive industrial heating units vibrating through the floorboards. I bypassed the main elevator banks entirely. Corporate elevators require active badge swipes that log entry times and specific floor destinations into a central, searchable database. If Harrison ever suspected a breach, those digital logs would be his very first point of reference. Instead, I navigated directly to the concrete fire stairs located in the rear service corridor. The stairwell door was secured with a heavy-duty magnetic lock, but it was an older model. I pulled a thin, flexible strip of rigid plastic from my bag, slid it effortlessly between the door and the metal frame, and expertly tripped the mechanical latch. The door popped open with barely a whisper. I began the grueling, exhausting climb up to the 14th floor. My 73-year-old lungs burned fiercely with every flight of concrete stairs, and the muscles in my thighs screamed in protest. But I did not stop to rest for a single second. The agonizing physical pain was a necessary sacrifice. My daughter's entire life depended entirely on my absolute success tonight. When I finally reached the 14th floor, I pushed the heavy metal fire door open just a fraction of an inch, scanning the darkened executive hallway for motion sensors or active laser tripwires. The corridor was clear. I stepped out onto the plush, sound-absorbing carpet and moved swiftly toward Harrison's private executive suite at the far end of the hall. The door to his office was locked with a sophisticated biometric keypad. A normal intruder would be completely stopped dead in their tracks. But Harrison suffered from the profound, blinding arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. He had opted for a high-end, visually impressive lock, completely ignoring the basic structural integrity of the doorframe itself. I pulled a specialized micro-tension wrench from my canvas bag, inserted it into the tiny mechanical override slot located beneath the scanner, and manipulated the internal tumblers with precise, calculated movements. Less than 30 seconds later, the heavy oak door swung silently open. Harrison's private office was massive, decorated in cold, aggressive tones of slate gray and polished chrome. It looked less like a workspace and more like a sterile modern monument to his own massive ego. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding panoramic view of the glittering Chicago skyline, but I completely ignored the breathtaking scenery. I immediately turned my attention to the ceiling. I needed a vantage point that was entirely undetectable, a location that the nightly cleaning crews would never bother to inspect. My eyes locked onto the large slatted metal HVAC vent positioned directly above his massive mahogany desk. It was the absolute perfect location. I quietly rolled his heavy leather executive chair directly under the vent and climbed up, balancing carefully on the padded armrests. I pulled my insulated gloves on and used a specialized micro screwdriver to quietly remove the 4 painted screws, holding the metal grate securely in place. I lowered the heavy grate down and reached my arm deep into the dusty, vibrating metal ductwork. I retrieved the 3 military-grade micro-audio recorders from my bag. These were not cheap, commercial devices. They were voice-activated, highly sensitive instruments capable of capturing a whisper from across a crowded room. I placed the first recorder deep inside the duct, pointing the microphone directly toward the large leather sofa in the corner. I mounted the second recorder on the opposite side, angling it toward the main doorway. I placed the third recorder perfectly in the center, directly above where Harrison would sit in his expensive chair. By triangulating the 3 hidden microphones, I ensured that absolutely no conversation, no hushed phone call, and no illicit meeting would ever escape my surveillance net. Finally, I retrieved the high-definition pinhole camera. The tiny lens was virtually invisible to the naked eye. I positioned it directly behind the metal slats. The device was hardwired to a powerful lithium battery pack, guaranteeing continuous transmission. I secured the grate back into its original position, eliminating all physical evidence of my intrusion. I carefully lowered myself from the heavy leather chair, ensuring the casters rolled silently back into their exact original indentations on the plush carpet. I wiped down the armrests with a microfiber cloth, erasing any trace of my presence. The descent down the 14 flights of concrete stairs was a blur of burning muscles and heavy breathing, but the adrenaline surging through my veins pushed the physical pain entirely into the background. I slipped out the rear service door just as the distant wail of a police siren echoed through the freezing Chicago night. I climbed back into the rusted delivery van, my hands gripping the freezing steering wheel, and drove back toward the desolate industrial outskirts of the city. I returned the van to the mechanic, slipped him another $100 for his absolute silence, and walked the remaining 6 blocks to my motel room. The buzzing neon sign outside my window flickered aggressively as I unlocked the thin wooden door. I did not bother turning on the main overhead light. I simply pulled the thick stained curtains completely shut, plunging the small room into total darkness. I sat at the scratched wooden desk, opened the cheap burner laptop I had purchased earlier, and booted up the specialized receiver software. I connected the encrypted digital receiver to the USB port, my eyes glued to the loading screen. Within seconds, 3 distinct audio waveforms appeared on the glowing monitor. The high-definition pinhole camera feed flickered to life, providing a crystal-clear, wide-angle view of Harrison Croft's pristine executive office. The trap was perfectly set. Now I needed the heavy artillery. I needed a man who could navigate the complex, treacherous labyrinth of international finance just as skillfully as I navigated a physical security grid. I picked up my prepaid burner phone and dialed a number I had memorized over 20 years ago. It was nearly 4 in the morning, but the man on the other end of the line answered on the second ring. His voice was gravelly and sharp, instantly alert despite the hour. It was Thomas. Thomas was a retired forensic auditor, a man who possessed a terrifyingly brilliant mind for numbers and an absolute ruthlessness when it came to tracking dirty money. Decades ago, Thomas had found himself heavily targeted by a violent local syndicate after he uncovered a massive embezzlement scheme at a commercial construction firm. The syndicate had sent men to silence him permanently. I was the security contractor hired to upgrade his home defenses, but when the hitmen actually breached his property, I did not just rely on the alarms. I personally intervened, breaking 3 ribs and a collarbone of the men trying to kill him and keeping Thomas safe until the federal authorities arrived. He owed me his life, and he had explicitly told me that if I ever needed a favor, no matter the cost, no matter the legality, I only had to make the call. Thomas, "It is Richard," I said quietly into the receiver. "I am sorry to wake you, but I need to call in that favor." There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by the sound of a heavy chair creaking as he sat up. "Tell me what you need, Richard." Thomas replied, his tone devoid of any hesitation. "I need you to hunt," I explained, keeping my voice steady and cold. "I am sending you a highly encrypted file containing a set of routing numbers and the name of a limited liability holding group registered here in Illinois. The parent company is Croft Enterprises. 3 years ago, a wire transfer of $500,000 was sent to a specific account listed in that file. My son-in-law, Harrison Croft, claims that money is currently tied up in an agile equity transition and an overseas supplier debt. I know for a fact he is lying. I need you to pierce the corporate veil. I need to know exactly where my $500,000 went, what shell companies he is hiding behind, and the true financial health of his entire corporate portfolio. I need to know every single dirty secret he is keeping from my daughter." I could hear the rapid clicking of a mechanical keyboard on the other end of the line as Thomas immediately booted up his own systems. He was already working before I even finished my explanation. "Financial predators like this always follow a specific pattern," Richard Thomas said, his voice dropping into a low, focused register. "They layer their theft through dummy corporations to create a maze of plausible deniability. But money always leaves a digital footprint. If he moved your $500,000 offshore, I will find the exact ledger it landed in. Give me a few hours to breach the primary holding structures, and cross-reference the transactional metadata. I will tear his financial walls down to the studs. Do not call this number again. I will contact you when the blood is in the water. The line went dead. I set the burner phone down on the desk, feeling a profound sense of grim satisfaction. Harrison thought he was dealing with an uneducated blue-collar relic who could be easily intimidated by a few corporate buzzwords. He had absolutely no idea that I had just unleashed one of the most ruthless financial predators in the country directly into his personal bank accounts. I spent the remaining hours of the early morning sitting completely motionless in the hard wooden chair, staring intensely at the glowing laptop screen. The audio waveforms remained perfectly flat. The office was empty and silent. Outside, the industrial train yard began to rumble to life, the heavy steel cars clashing together as the sun slowly began to rise over the dreary suburban landscape. I did not sleep. I did not eat. I simply drank bitter, lukewarm tap water from a plastic cup and waited. Every muscle in my 73-year-old body ached profoundly from the physical exertion of the break-in. But my mind was incredibly sharp, fueled by a potent burning mixture of adrenaline and protective rage. I thought about Maya believing herself to be a failure, sitting in her beautiful home, while a monster methodically destroyed her sanity. I was not going to let him win. By 8 in the morning, the digital waveforms on the screen finally began to twitch. The soft, rhythmic sound of approaching footsteps echoed clearly through the high-grade microphones. The heavy oak door of the executive office swung open on the video feed. Harrison walked into the room looking immaculate in a tailored navy blue suit. He was carrying a sleek leather briefcase and a steaming cup of expensive coffee. He casually tossed his briefcase onto the leather sofa and sat down in his massive executive chair, completely unaware of the 3 military-grade microphones capturing his every single breath. I leaned closer to the laptop screen, increasing the volume on the receiver. Harrison tapped the screen of his desk phone and put it on speaker. The dial tone echoed loudly, followed by the sound of someone answering. It was his private wealth manager. Harrison began barking aggressive orders demanding immediate liquidity transfers from a secondary holding account to cover a massive shortfall. The tension in my dingy motel room skyrocketed. The hunt had officially begun, and the truth was finally bleeding out. I pulled a small notepad and a pen from my canvas bag, meticulously writing down every single name, account number, and offshore banking code that Harrison impatiently barked into the speakerphone. His voice was laced with an underlying panic that completely contradicted his calm, polished exterior. The wealthy, untouchable corporate titan was scrambling in the dark, desperately trying to plug holes in a sinking ship. He slammed his fist down on the mahogany desk, cursing his wealth manager for delaying the transfer protocols. I watched him massage his temples, the heavy weight of his hidden sins visibly pressing down on his shoulders. The pristine audio feed captured the rapid, shallow rhythm of his breathing. My trap was flawless. He had no idea that a retired construction worker was currently listening to his entire empire begin to collapse piece by piece right from a $40 motel room. The frantic pacing in the executive office suddenly stopped. I heard the heavy thud of Harrison collapsing back into his leather chair, followed by the clinking of heavy crystal as he poured himself a drink. Then the distinct electronic chime of the outer biometric lock echoed through my headphones. The heavy oak door swung open. The high-definition camera feed captured a woman stepping into the private suite. I recognized her immediately. It was Rachel, the lead designer for the fashion brand, and Maya's absolute closest friend since college. She was the woman who had stood beside my daughter as her maid of honor, the woman who had cried tears of joy at the wedding. Now she was casually locking the door behind her and walking straight toward my son-in-law with an unmistakable predatory swagger. I watched in sheer disgust as she bypassed the guest chairs entirely and slid directly onto Harrison's lap. He did not flinch. He did not push her away. Instead, his hands immediately wrapped around her waist, pulling her close. The audio feed picked up the sickening sound of their deep, breathless kiss. My stomach violently churned. This was not a sudden moment of weakness. The practiced, fluid nature of their physical intimacy proved that this profound betrayal had been going on for a very long time. Rachel trailed her manicured fingers through his perfectly styled hair, laughing softly as he buried his face in her neck. "You look like you are completely falling apart," Rachel murmured, her voice dripping with dark amusement. The audio was so crisp, I could hear the rustle of their expensive clothing rubbing together. Did the overseas suppliers call again? "You need to relax. We are almost at the finish line." Harrison let out a bitter, exhausted groan, leaning his head back against the heavy leather chair. It is not just the suppliers, Rachel," he muttered, pouring himself another glass of scotch with one hand while holding her with the other. "The secondary holding accounts are bleeding cash faster than I can shift the equity around. I had to scream at my wealth manager for 20 minutes just to authorize a bridging loan to cover the syndicate debt for another 48 hours. And to make matters infinitely worse, Maya's pathetic blue-collar father tried to force an independent audit on me at dinner last night." Rachel let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut right through my chest like a serrated blade. "Richard," she asked, practically choking on her amusement, "the old construction worker actually thinks he can read a corporate balance sheet. That is absolutely hilarious. Did he wear his steel-toed boots to the steakhouse?" I sat frozen in the dimly lit motel room, my hands gripping the edge of the cheap wooden desk so hard my joints ached. I listened to my daughter's best friend mercilessly humiliate me, but the insults directed at my own intelligence meant absolutely nothing. It was the casual, effortless cruelty they both displayed toward Maya that truly terrified me. Harrison chuckled darkly, taking a long sip of his drink. He actually offered to wire $200,000 of his own retirement money to save the brand. It took everything in my power not to laugh directly in his weathered face. I almost took the cash, but the idiot insisted on bringing his personal accountant to audit my ledgers first. I had to play the insulted billionaire to back him off. Rachel traced the rim of his glass, pouting her lips, in a grotesque display of fake sympathy. "Poor Maya," she cooed, her tone dripping with venomous sarcasm. She must have been absolutely terrified that her daddy was going to ruin everything. "How is the little tragic heroine holding up today? Is she still crying in the fabric room?" Harrison snorted a cruel, dismissive sound that echoed loudly through my headphones. "She is completely hysterical. I spent 20 minutes screaming at her yesterday about the ruined overseas inventory just to keep her emotionally destabilized. She genuinely believes she single-handedly destroyed a $2 million shipment. She spent the entire night begging me for forgiveness, telling me how incredibly grateful she is that I am liquidating my own trust fund to save her pathetic little dream. She is so incredibly stupid, Rachel. She literally thanked me for saving her life." They both erupted into genuine, heartless laughter. I closed my eyes, a single tear of pure, unadulterated rage sliding down my weathered cheek. My beautiful, brilliant girl was sitting in her house right now, drowning in an ocean of manufactured guilt, while the two people she trusted most in this world mocked her pain. They had orchestrated the fake inventory disaster entirely to break her spirit. They were actively driving her to the brink of a nervous breakdown just to keep her thoroughly distracted from the actual financial reality of the company. "I do not know how you stand her." Harrison. Rachel sighed, resting her head against his chest. "She is so incredibly weak. She actually called me crying this morning, asking if I thought you were going to divorce her over the money she lost. I had to pretend to comfort her for a solid hour. It is exhausting playing the supportive best friend when all I want to do is pack our bags and get on the plane. When exactly are we dropping the final curtain on this miserable performance?" "Soon," Harrison replied, his voice hardening with cold, calculated precision. "The corporate shell structures are almost fully primed for the final collapse. But we have to stick to the timeline perfectly. Maya is the key to the entire exit strategy. She has to remain completely compliant and thoroughly convinced that the brand is just suffering from standard operational failures. If she wakes up and realizes what is actually happening before the end of the month, the entire syndicate debt falls directly on my shoulders. Rachel shifted her weight on his lap, looking deeply into his eyes. Are you absolutely certain that the legal firewall is completely secure? She asked, a hint of genuine anxiety bleeding into her voice. If the federal authorities or the syndicate trace the missing $15 million back to Croft Enterprises, they will tear us apart. We need to be absolutely positive that Maya takes the entire legal impact of the bankruptcy. Harrison smirked a deeply evil expression that twisted his handsome features into something demonic. I watched him reach into the breast pocket of his suit and pull out a small silver key. He leaned over, unlocked the bottom drawer of his heavy mahogany desk, and retrieved a thick black leather binder. He tossed it onto the desk right in front of Rachel. I am perfectly secure, he boasted smoothly. Maya does not own a single fraction of a % of the actual corporate equity, but she thinks she is the supreme chief executive officer. 3 years ago, when her father handed over that $500,000, I had my legal team draft the foundational operating agreements. I buried a dozen liability clauses deep inside the signature pages. Maya was so easily played. His arrogant, venomous words echoed relentlessly in my ears. I felt a cold, physical sickness spreading through my chest. My beautiful girl, who had worked 80 hours a week trying to build a legitimate business, was nothing more than a disposable legal shield for a corporate psychopath. I reached out with a trembling hand and picked up my cheap burner phone. I did not have to wait long. At exactly 9 in the morning, the phone vibrated violently against the scratched wooden desk. I answered it immediately, pressing the cold plastic to my ear. It was Thomas. His breathing was, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. He had been working continuously through the night, tearing down the financial walls of Croft Enterprises, just as he had promised. Richard Thomas began, his tone uncharacteristically grim, lacking his usual sharp confidence. You need to sit down and prepare yourself. I have completely breached his secondary holding accounts, and what I found is significantly worse than simple embezzlement. I am sitting down, Thomas, I replied, my voice a hollow rasp. Just tell me exactly what the monster did with my money. Thomas let out a long, ragged sigh. Your $500,000 never went to a single vendor, Richard. It did not go to overseas fabric suppliers, and it certainly did not go into an agile equity transition. I traced the routing numbers through 3 different offshore shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. The moment you authorized that wire transfer 3 years ago, Harrison swept the funds directly into an untraceable digital ledger. From there, the money was instantly liquidated to pay off a massive, catastrophic string of illegal sports betting debts. I closed my eyes, absorbing the sickening reality. My life savings, the money I had bled for on freezing construction sites, the money I had sacrificed to give my daughter a future, had been thrown away on illicit gambling. Harrison is a degenerate, high-stakes gambler, Thomas continued, his keyboard clacking rapidly in the background as he pulled up more files. He has been systematically losing millions of dollars on illegal offshore betting platforms for the last 5 years. He uses the pristine corporate reputation of Croft Enterprises as a shiny, legitimate cover to mask a severe, spiraling addiction. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was staggering, but I knew Thomas had not called me just to report a gambling problem. You said it was worse than embezzlement. Thomas, I prompted, my grip tightening on the small phone. What else did you find in those ledgers? Thomas paused, and the silence on the line felt incredibly dangerous. The fashion brand is not a real business, Richard. It is a highly sophisticated financial front. When Harrison blew through his own liquid trust fund and your $500,000, he did not stop gambling. He sought out private, unregulated capital. He borrowed heavily from a violent shadow syndicate based out of Eastern Europe. They are essentially a high-level organized crime ring that operates as an unlicensed lending institution for desperate corporate executives. Harrison currently owes them $15 million in principal, and the exorbitant interest is compounding daily. My blood ran absolutely cold. $15 million. The number felt entirely surreal, an impossible weight crushing the air out of my lungs. I has been using Maya's company to slowly launder small fractions of that dirty money, trying to keep the syndicate bosses pacified. Thomas explained, his voice tight with genuine fear. But he has run out of time, and he has run out of capital. The syndicate is demanding their $15 million in full by the end of this month, or they will start collecting in blood. I stared at the audio waveforms on my computer screen, remembering the cruel, mocking laughter of Harrison and Rachel just moments ago. They had joked about being so close to the finish line. They had bragged about packing their bags and dropping the final curtain on this miserable performance. I suddenly understood the terrifying scope of their exit strategy. Thomas, I whispered, my throat dry and aching. What happens at the end of the month when he cannot pay the $15 million? Thomas delivered the final devastating blow. Harrison is preparing to abruptly file for total corporate bankruptcy on the 1st of the month. He is going to completely collapse the fashion brand and let the offshore holding companies absorb the massive default. But here is the most terrifying part, Richard. Because he buried those liability clauses in Maya's foundational operating agreements, she is legally classified as the sole personal guarantor for every single one of those fraudulent loans. The moment he files the bankruptcy paperwork, Harrison legally walks away clean. The federal authorities and the syndicate will follow the fabricated paper trail directly to your daughter. Maya will take the absolute fall for massive federal wire fraud, international money laundering, and grand larceny. She will be facing a minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary, and the syndicate will hold her personally responsible for the missing $15 million. The phone slipped slightly in my sweaty palm. My mind raced through the terrifying implications of what Thomas had just uncovered. Harrison had built a meticulously crafted financial guillotine, and he had placed my daughter's neck squarely on the chopping block. He had spent 3 years breaking her down psychologically, destroying her self-esteem, and making her believe she was an incompetent failure, all so she would never question the documents he placed in front of her. She had unknowingly signed away her freedom, her future, and potentially her life, simply because she trusted her husband. I is going to destroy her, I said, the reality of the situation settling heavily over me. I is going to let her take the blame for his gambling addiction, and he is going to flee the country with Rachel. Thomas agreed grimly. Yes. I found flight reservations hidden in his personal email server. He has 2 first-class one-way tickets to a non-extradition country, booked for the 2nd day of next month. He and Rachel are planning to completely vanish, leaving Maya holding a $15 million bag of illegal debt and facing the full aggressive wrath of both the federal government and a violent criminal organization. I stood up from the wooden desk, pacing the short length of the dingy motel room. The anger that had been simmering inside me over the stolen money was entirely gone. Money could be replaced. Money did not matter. This was no longer about a failed business venture or a stolen retirement fund. This was a literal fight for my daughter's survival. Harrison Croft was not just an arrogant, wealthy thief. I was a sociopathic monster who was actively planning to feed my only child to the wolves to save his own skin. I need everything. Thomas, I commanded, my voice completely stripped of any residual shock or fear. I need every single digital ledger. I need the offshore routing numbers, the syndicate loan agreements, the forged liability clauses, and the flight itineraries. Download the entire server and encrypt it on a secure external drive. I want an absolute mountain of undeniable concrete evidence. Consider it done, Richard. Thomas replied, the sharp, relentless focus returning to his voice. I am compiling the data packets right now. But what exactly is your play here? If we take this to the local police, Harrison has enough high-priced lawyers to tie this up in litigation for years. He will post bail, destroy the remaining evidence, and slip out of the country before a judge even looks at the file. I walked over to the motel window, pulling the heavy curtain back, just a fraction of an inch, to look out at the rusting train yard. The The morning sun was casting long, hard shadows across the steel tracks. "We are not going to the local police, Thomas," I said coldly. "Harrison wants to play in the big leagues. We are going to oblige him. Keep digging. Do not stop until you have completely mapped out his entire corporate network. I will call you back when it is time to strike." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the bed. I needed to prepare myself for the next phase of this miserable war. The monster had to pay. I sat back down in the hard wooden chair and stared blankly at the glowing monitor. My daughter was walking blindly into a trap, and I was the only person left in this world who could pull her out before the steel jaws snapped shut permanently. I sat alone in the stifling darkness of the motel room. The heavy weight of Thomas and his devastating discoveries pressing down on my chest like an anchor. My daughter was legally bound to a $15 million debt she knew nothing about. The walls of her life were actively crumbling, and the architect of her destruction was sitting in a plush leather chair just a few miles away drinking expensive scotch with his mistress. I forced myself to take a slow breath, trying to steady the trembling in my calloused hands. I reached out to the cheap laptop glowing on the scratched desk and turned the volume dial on the digital receiver up a fraction more. The 3 hidden microphones I had installed deep inside the air vents of Croft Enterprises were working flawlessly. I could hear the faint clinking of ice against crystal glass. I could hear the soft rustle of Rachel's clothing as she shifted her weight on Harrison's lap. They were completely relaxed, entirely comfortable in their private sanctuary of deception, unaware that the man they were plotting against was listening to their every single breath. The conversation in the office had lulled for a few minutes, replaced by the sickening sounds of their quiet intimacy. But then Rachel pulled back her voice, cutting through the static of the live feed with a sharp edge of genuine anxiety. She took a slow sip of her drink and set the glass down on the mahogany desk. "What about her father?" Rachel asked, her tone suddenly lacking its previous arrogant warmth. "We have meticulously planned this entire bankruptcy, and we have Maya perfectly positioned to take the absolute fall for the federal wire fraud. But Rich is a massive, unpredictable liability. You saw him at the steakhouse. That old contractor is incredibly stubborn, and he is deeply suspicious of the corporate ledgers. What happens when he comes back from his little fishing trip in Florida? If he walks back into Chicago and sees his daughter facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary, he is not just going to roll over and accept it. He is going to hire his own auditors. He is going to tear this company apart, looking for answers, and he might find the syndicate connections before we can board our flight." A low, dark chuckle rumbled through the audio feed. It was a chilling, deeply sinister sound that originated from the very bottom of Harrison's chest. I listened as he shifted in his heavy leather chair, the leather creaking softly under his weight. "You worry entirely too much," Rachel Harrison murmured, his voice dripping with supreme, untouchable confidence. "I am a professional. I do not leave loose ends lying around, especially not an aging, blue-collar dinosaur who thinks he can intimidate me. Richard is absolutely never coming back from Florida." My old heart stalled completely in my chest. The blood roaring in my ears grew deafening, but I forced myself to remain completely still, hanging onto his terrifying words. "What do you mean he is not coming back?" Rachel finally asked, her voice dropping into a hushed, breathless whisper. Harrison let out another arrogant laugh. "That exclusive luxury deep-sea boat rental I purchased for his getaway. Do you honestly think I booked that out of the kindness of my heart? I used a private broker who caters to clients needing permanent solutions. The mechanic at that marina is on my payroll. Last night, while Richard packed his bags, that mechanic was preparing the vessel. He severed the primary fuel line, leaving just enough intact to get the boat 20 miles offshore into the isolated waters of the Gulf of Mexico. Once the engine runs hot, the line will rupture." I sat frozen in the hard wooden chair, my mind struggling to process the sheer, unadulterated evil radiating through the computer speakers. And that is not even the most brilliant part. Harrison continued boasting about his murderous ingenuity. The mechanic also bypassed the electrical grid and disabled the bilge pump. By the time Richard realizes his engine is dead, the hull will be taking on water. He will be stranded in the ocean with zero power, a flooding deck, and no radio to broadcast a distress signal. Furthermore, I selected this weekend because a Category 3 tropical storm is rolling into that exact sector of the Gulf. The Coast Guard issued severe warnings. When the storm hits, that boat will capsize and sink to the bottom in minutes. He is going to drown in the dark, and the local authorities will classify it as a tragic boating accident caused by an old man who stubbornly ignored weather advisories. Rachel let out a stunned gasp. Harry, that is absolute insanity. Are you telling me you actually arranged to have him killed? I did not just arrange to have him killed, Rachel Harrison corrected her, his tone brimming with sociopathic pride. I aggressively monetized his death. 6 months ago, when I realized the syndicate debt was compounding beyond my capacity, I needed a capital injection that could not be traced back to the fashion brand. So I logged into Maya's private email server. I expertly forged her digital signature and took out a comprehensive $2 million life insurance policy on her father. Because I executed the policy using her verified credentials, she is listed as the sole primary beneficiary. The calculated depth of his malice was almost impossible to comprehend. He had weaponized my death to finance his escape. Think about the poetry of the timing, Rachel Harrison whispered smoothly, reveling in his twisted genius. Richard drowns in a storm this weekend. The authorities declare him legally dead by Monday. I use my power of attorney over Maya's personal accounts to intercept the $2 million insurance payout the moment it clears. I take that untraceable blood money and hand it directly to the syndicate boss to buy our freedom. Then I trigger the corporate bankruptcy protocol just as planned. Maya takes the fall for the remaining $15 million of debt and goes to federal prison for wire fraud. The syndicate is satisfied, the federal investigators get their scapegoat, and you and I board a private jet to Europe with clean identities. We win everything, and Maya takes the blame for a disaster she did not even know existed. The audio feed fell silent for a long moment. Then I heard Rachel let out a low, impressed sigh. You are an absolute genius, Harry. She murmured, the sound of their lips meeting once again, echoing through the laptop speakers. I love you so very incredibly much. I slowly reached out and pressed the mute button on the receiver keyboard. The dingy motel room plunged back into total, suffocating silence. I sat alone in the dark, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper directly in front of me. The stale air in the room felt incredibly thin, as if the oxygen had been completely sucked out of the building. My hands were no longer trembling. The furious storm of anxiety and confusion that had plagued me for weeks suddenly vanished, entirely replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. I did not scream. I did not throw my laptop against the peeling wallpaper or smash the cheap wooden desk with my fists. A younger man, or a man who had never faced true violence, might have given in to the crushing wave of panic. But I was 73 years old, and I had spent 4 decades securing environments against men exactly like Harrison Croft. When you realize that you are trapped in a cage with a predator who is actively planning to kill you, emotion becomes a massive liability. Fear is a luxury you can no longer afford. I sat perfectly still in the suffocating darkness of that $40 motel room, taking slow, measured breaths. Every inhalation was a deliberate anchor, grounding me in the immediate reality of my situation. Harrison was not just a greedy, manipulative corporate thief trying to steal my retirement fund. He was a ruthless, calculating sociopath who had meticulously planned my execution and aggressively monetized my impending death. He had actually hired a mechanic to sever a fuel line on a deep-sea vessel. He had tracked the meteorological reports, deliberately choosing a weekend when a tropical storm would guarantee my watery grave. He had forged my daughter's signature on a $2 million life insurance policy, effectively turning her into an unwitting accomplice to my murder. The sheer magnitude of his evil was almost impossible to process, but I forced my mind to compartmentalize the horror. The dynamic of this entire conflict had just shifted violently on its axis. This was no longer a simple domestic dispute over corporate equity or stolen savings. This was a literal, unvarnished fight for survival. If I made a single misstep, if I tipped my hand too early or acted purely out of blind rage, I would end up dead at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, and Maya would be locked inside a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. I could not just stop him anymore. I had to utterly obliterate him. I reached across the dark desk, my hand moving with steady, terrifying precision, and picked up the prepaid burner phone. I dialed that number. This time he answered on the very first ring, sensing the immediate urgency in my digital ping. "Thomas," I said, my voice completely stripped of any human warmth, sounding like a machine, processing a lethal command. "You need to stop tracking the offshore holding accounts for a moment. We have a massive escalation." "What is it, Richard?" Thomas asked, the rapid clicking of his mechanical keyboard instantly silencing. "Did he move the 15 million? "No," I replied, staring blankly at the muted audio waveforms dancing silently on my monitor screen. "He just explained his exit strategy to Rachel. He is not just planning to file for bankruptcy and let Maya take the fall for the syndicate debt. He is planning to pay the syndicate off using my blood. He rented me a rigged boat in Florida. The fuel line is severed, the bilge pump is disabled, and he forged Maya's signature on a $2 million life insurance policy. He is sending me into a Category 3 tropical storm to drown." For the first time since I had known the brilliant, ruthless forensic auditor Thomas was completely speechless. The heavy, dead silence on the line stretched for several agonizing seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice was a tight, low hiss of pure disbelief. "I is going to murder you." Thomas breathed out, processing the sheer audacity of the scheme. "Richard, you have to pack your bags and leave that motel right now. We need to go straight to the local authorities. If he has a mechanic on his payroll, there is a physical paper trail. We can get you police protection immediately." "No," I interrupted sharply, rejecting the idea without a second thought. "If we take this to the Chicago Police Department right now, Harrison will hire a team of elite defense attorneys by morning. He will claim the audio recordings were illegally obtained, inadmissible in a court of law, and a gross violation of his corporate privacy. He will post bail, destroy the physical evidence on the boat, liquidate his remaining assets, and flee the country with Rachel before the prosecutor even assigns a detective to the case. And he will leave Maya behind to be slaughtered by the syndicate. I am not going to let him hide behind his high-priced lawyers. I want him trapped, financially ruined, and completely stripped of his freedom." "What exactly is the play then, Richard?" Thomas asked, the sharp, relentless focus returning to his voice. "I need you to compile every single piece of financial data you have pulled from his servers tonight." I instructed, my plan forming with crystal clear precision. "Package the offshore routing numbers, the forged liability clauses, the syndicate loan agreements, and the flight itineraries into a highly encrypted master file. I am going to extract the pristine audio recordings of his murder confession from my receiver and merge them with your financial documents. We are going to build an airtight, completely undeniable dossier. We are taking this entirely out of local jurisdiction." "Who are you taking this to?" Thomas asked. "The federal government," I replied smoothly. Back when I was actively running heavy security contracts for municipal buildings, I did some highly specialized consulting work for a man named Agent Marcus Thorne. He is now a senior director operating deep inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically handling high-level organized crime and massive international wire fraud. He knows exactly how violent these Eastern European lending syndicates are, and he absolutely despises corporate criminals who think they can outsmart the federal system. If I hand him an ironclad package proving that Harrison is laundering $15 million for a known criminal organization and actively orchestrating an interstate murder for hire scheme to commit insurance fraud, Thorne will not just arrest him. He will freeze his entire existence. I understand perfectly, Thomas said, his keyboard springing back to life with a furious rapid-fire rhythm. Give me exactly 1 hour to compile the data packets and encrypt the transfer protocols. Start pulling your audio files now. We are going to bury this arrogant monster so deep under a federal penitentiary that he will never see the sun again. The encrypted line went completely dead. I set the burner phone down and turned my full, undivided attention back to the cheap laptop. I unmuted the receiver carefully, isolating the specific audio track that contained Harrison's chilling confession. I listened to him laugh about my impending death, one more time letting the vile, arrogant sound of his voice burn itself into my memory. It served as the ultimate fuel for the war I was about to unleash. I expertly clipped the audio file, enhancing the vocal frequencies to ensure every single malicious word was perfectly clear and absolutely undeniable. I securely saved the new compressed digital file directly to an encrypted backup flash drive, carefully pairing it with the digital photographs I had taken of the complex corporate ledgers during my initial extensive financial investigation. By the time the sun breached the horizon, my encrypted dossier was complete. I ejected the flash drive, slipped it into my jacket, and walked out of that dingy motel room. I left the cheap electronics sitting on the desk. I climbed into my truck and drove directly toward the federal building in downtown Chicago. I was no longer a terrified father reacting to a corporate bully. I was a man delivering a loaded weapon to the government. Inside the high-security lobby, I requested an immediate audience with Director Thorne. The armed guards were initially dismissive, but when I gave them my security clearance codes from past municipal contracts, their demeanor shifted. Within 10 minutes, I was sitting inside a soundproof interrogation room. Director Thorne walked in shortly after. I placed the encrypted flash drive on the metal table and laid out the terrifying reality. I walked him through the fake inventory crisis, the offshore shell companies, the $15 million debt to the Eastern European syndicate, and the murder scheme in Florida. Thorne plugged the drive into his terminal and reviewed the files. When he listened to the pristine audio recording of Harrison discussing my impending death by drowning, the seasoned agent went rigid. Thorne had spent years trying to dismantle that specific shadow syndicate, and Harrison had just handed him the key to their illicit network. But Thorne knew if they simply arrested Harrison now, the syndicate would instantly scatter, the offshore accounts would vanish, and elite defense lawyers would tie the attempted murder charges up in endless red tape. We needed to catch him in the undeniable act of committing massive wire fraud. We needed him to actively trigger his exit strategy. To do that, we had to give him a highly convincing ghost. The illusion was set into motion with terrifying efficiency. Thorne immediately contacted the Coast Guard sector operating down in the Florida Keys. They orchestrated a brilliant piece of tactical theater. On Saturday morning, just as the tropical storm began churning the dark waters of the Gulf, the corrupt mechanic on Harrison's payroll dispatched the luxury deep-sea vessel as planned. He believed I was down in the cabin unaware of the severed fuel line and disabled bilge pump. However, the moment the boat cleared the marina, a heavily armored Coast Guard interceptor quietly overtook it. Federal agents boarded the vessel, secured the tampered mechanical evidence, and towed the boat to a classified dry dock. Then the Federal Bureau dropped the bait. They utilized their media contacts to release a fabricated local news report across the Florida broadcast networks. The news anchors somberly reported that a 73-year-old tourist from Chicago had tragically gone missing after taking a rental boat out into the dangerous storm-ravaged waters. They reported that the vessel had been found capsized and heavily damaged by the violent swells, with the sole passenger presumed lost at sea. It was a masterpiece of digital deception. We had a front-row seat to watch the monster swallow the hook. I sat beside Director Thorne in a darkened cyber surveillance room deep inside the federal building, staring at a wall of glowing monitors. Thomas was patched directly into the secure network from his remote location, actively tracing every single keystroke Harrison made on his corporate servers. The live audio feed from the fashion office was broadcasting clearly through the overhead speakers. I listened intently, as the heavy oak door opened and Harrison marched into his suite. We heard the distinct rustle of a newspaper, followed by the rapid tapping of his keyboard as he pulled up the Florida news broadcasts. A moment later, Rachel rushed into the office, locking the door behind her. "Did you see the regional alerts?" she asked, her voice trembling with a sickening mixture of anxiety and eager anticipation. "Did it actually happen, Harry? Is the old man truly gone?" I heard Harrison let out a long breath of relief. "The Coast Guard found the boat completely overturned this morning." Harrison laughed, the sound echoing maliciously through the room. "The hull was flooded. The authorities have officially called off the search and rescue operation due to severe weather. He is dead, Rachel. The arrogant old fool is permanently at the bottom of the ocean. We are completely in the clear." The elation in his voice was nauseating, but I did not react. I watched the monitors as Thomas flagged massive spikes in activity across Harrison's private network. Believing I was out of the picture, Harrison abandoned his cautious financial protocols. He moved with the reckless speed of a man who thought he had pulled off the perfect crime. We listened to him pick up his desk phone and immediately contact his life insurance broker. Utilizing the forged signatures stolen from my daughter, he officially initiated the $2 million death benefit claim, citing the tragic loss of his father-in-law in a maritime accident. That single phone call cemented his federal wire fraud charges. The most crucial movement was yet to come. Harrison needed to consolidate the syndicate money before he could flee. On the surveillance screen, Thomas isolated a massive transfer protocol originating from Croft Enterprises. Harrison was draining every remaining asset from the fashion brand's operational accounts, completely hollowing out Maya's company. He routed the stolen funds through a maze of international shell companies, attempting to wash the money clean before depositing it into a singular, untraceable offshore exit account in the Cayman Islands. He was gathering the $15 million in one place, preparing to pay off the syndicate boss and vanish. Director Thorne leaned forward, resting firmly on the control desk. He looked closely at the real-time data pouring across the bright monitors, watching the staggering sums of stolen money jump from ledger to ledger. He waited quietly for the perfect moment when Harrison had fully committed his entire financial existence to that single offshore transfer. We listened to Harrison uncork a bottle of champagne in his private office, toasting loudly with Rachel to their impending flight to Europe. They were celebrating a massive victory built entirely on my imagined corpse. "Hold the perimeter tightly," Thorne instructed the cyber team, his eyes locked intensely on the primary transfer progress bar. "Let him push the entire $15 million into the final funnel. We want him completely exposed. We want every single cent of that syndicate money trapped securely in transit." I watched the screen silently as the digital progress bar inched closer to completion. Harrison Croft was currently standing in his luxurious office, drinking champagne and looking out over the Chicago skyline, absolutely convinced he was a god among men. He thought he had successfully murdered his father-in-law, financially ruined his wife, and outsmarted a violent international crime syndicate. He had no idea that a 73-year-old ghost was sitting in a federal building, patiently waiting to drop a financial guillotine directly on his neck. The trap was perfect. The end was officially coming very soon. Director Thorne picked up the secure telephone resting on the edge of the control desk. He connected directly to a federal judge who handled emergency financial injunctions for the Organized Crime Division. The room was deathly quiet as Thorne concisely laid out the overwhelming evidence we had compiled. He described the massive $15 million syndicate debt, the complex offshore shell companies, and the irrefutable proof of a calculated murder-for-hire scheme involving a severed fuel line on a deep-sea vessel. But the absolute final nail in the coffin was the life insurance policy. When Thorne explained that Harrison had forged my daughter's signature to weaponize my fabricated death in order to pay off an international criminal organization, the federal judge did not hesitate for a single second. Through the speakerphone, we heard the judge grant an immediate ex parte order. It gave the Federal Bureau of Investigation the unquestionable authority to freeze every single asset connected to Harrison Croft and his vast network of dummy corporations. The legal weapon was fully armed and loaded. Now we just needed the target to walk directly into the crosshairs. I turned my attention back to the glowing monitors. Thomas was operating with terrifying speed. His fingers flew across his mechanical keyboard, writing specialized containment scripts that hovered invisibly right over Harrison's primary offshore account in the Cayman Islands. We were watching a digital bank heist happen in real time, but the thief had absolutely no idea that the vault he was locking his stolen money into was actually a federal cage. On the primary surveillance screen, a bright green progress bar steadily advanced. Harrison was actively liquidating the last remaining operational capital from Maya's fashion brand. I was aggressively draining the employee payroll accounts, emptying the vendor payment reserves and completely gutting the corporate credit lines. He was leaving my daughter with nothing but an empty shell and a massive mountain of toxic radioactive debt. The live audio feed from his executive suite captured the sickening sound of his triumphant laughter. Rachel was actively cheering him on, completely intoxicated by the massive numbers flashing on their own office monitor. They were celebrating their absolute victory, completely blind to the fact that their digital getaway car was parked directly on top of a massive federal landmine. 98%. 99%. The digital progress bar finally hit 100%, and a string of incoming deposit notifications illuminated Thomas' monitor. The entire $15 million of stolen syndicate capital had officially landed securely in the offshore holding account. Harrison had successfully moved the dirty money across international lines, committing massive, undeniable federal wire fraud in the process. Director Thorne leaned close to the microphone, connecting him directly to Thomas. "Execute the freeze," Thorne commanded, his voice cold and perfectly steady. Thomas slammed his finger down on the heavy enter key. The execution was instantaneous and absolutely devastating. The specialized containment scripts Thomas had written completely enveloped the Cayman Islands account, with the full backing of the International Banking Coalition and the emergency federal injunction. The offshore ledger was aggressively locked down. The $15 million was frozen utterly solid. But Thorne did not stop there. He unleashed the full, terrifying power of the federal government directly onto Harrison's entire existence. Within a matter of seconds, automated federal warrants slammed into every domestic banking institution connected to the Croft family. Harrison's personal checking accounts were frozen. His high-yield investment portfolios were locked. His corporate credit cards were instantly canceled. Even the secretive family trust funds he had bragged about were completely seized by the Department of Justice. The financial guillotine had fallen with ruthless precision, severing his head from his empire in the blink of an eye. Thorne then issued a critical secondary command to the Border Patrol and the Transportation Security Administration. Harrison's biometric passport, along with Rachel's, was immediately flagged with a flight risk alert. If they attempted to foot inside any international airport or board their private jet to Europe, heavily armed federal marshals would swarm them before they even reached the security checkpoint. They were entirely trapped inside the country, and they possessed zero liquid capital to finance a domestic escape. I sat back in my chair, staring closely at the cascading red alerts lighting up Thomas' monitor, confirming that every single account had been successfully neutralized. In less than 60 seconds, Harrison Croft had gone from being a wealthy, arrogant corporate titan to an absolutely penniless criminal suspect. He did not have enough accessible money to buy a cup of coffee, let alone hire elite defense attorneys. I was dead broke, entirely cornered, and fundamentally ruined. Yet the live audio feed from his office told a completely different story. We could still hear the clinking of expensive champagne flutes and the sounds of celebratory kissing. Harrison was currently boasting to Rachel about how incredibly easy it was to outsmart the federal authorities and the violent Eastern European lending syndicate. I was completely oblivious to the absolute fact that his digital empire had just been reduced to ashes. He genuinely thought he was holding a winning lottery ticket, completely unaware that it was actually a one-way ticket to a federal penitentiary. I felt a profound, chilling sense of satisfaction wash over my tired body. My beautiful daughter was no longer financially tethered to an abusive monster. The toxic debt had been securely intercepted, and the devastating legal blowback Harrison had specifically designed to destroy her had been completely redirected back onto his own shoulders. The $15 million belonged to the federal government now as seized illicit assets. The violent syndicate would very soon realize that Harrison had attempted to steal their money and run permanently, marking him as a dead man, walking the exact moment he stepped into a prison cell. But my work was not entirely finished just yet. Freezing his assets and securing the federal warrants was only the sterile administrative side of my revenge. Harrison had looked me in the eye and relentlessly mocked my entire existence. He had viciously called my daughter a broke little rat. He had meticulously planned to drown me in the dark ocean and weaponize my tragic death to buy his absolute freedom. A man who commits that level of profound personal evil does not just deserve to be quietly arrested in his private office on a random Tuesday morning. I slowly and deliberately turned to Director Thorne. "The trap is perfectly set, Director," I said smoothly. "But I do not want your agents to arrest him right now. He still thinks he has completely won. Tomorrow night is the anniversary gala for my daughter's brand. He is going to be standing proudly on a stage in front of the elite corporate society of Chicago. I want to let him get up on that stage. I want to look him dead in the eyes when his entire world completely collapses around him." I smiled coldly. "He is going to lose everything, and everyone is going to sit there and watch it burn right to the absolute ground. My vengeance is completely ready to begin now." Friday evening arrived with a bitter, biting wind that swept off Lake Michigan, but inside the grand ballroom of the historic downtown hotel. The atmosphere was suffocatingly warm and dripping with absolute opulence. This was the highly anticipated third anniversary gala for my daughter's fashion brand. The massive room was a blinding sea of crystal chandeliers, towering floral arrangements, and flowing champagne. The entire venue was packed shoulder to shoulder with the absolute elite of Chicago corporate society. Wealthy investors, prominent socialites, and powerful real estate moguls mingled effortlessly, wearing their finest designer clothing and flashing their brightest, most manufactured smiles. But hidden carefully among the glittering crowd were the quiet, observant watchers. I knew exactly who they were. They were the silent enforcers sent by the Eastern European lending syndicate, standing near the exits with their hands folded, waiting to ensure Harrison Croft delivered their $15 million by midnight. They blended into the high society background perfectly, but my trained contractor eyes spotted their rigid tactical postures immediately. They were waiting for their money. They had absolutely no idea that their money was currently locked inside a federal vault. I was standing completely motionless in the darkened service corridor, concealed entirely behind the heavy velvet curtains that separated the bustling catering kitchen from the main ballroom floor. Director Thorne was standing quietly beside me in the shadows, accompanied by 4 heavily armed federal agents, dressed immaculately in tailored evening wear. We had infiltrated the building through the underground loading dock hours ago, bypassing the primary security checkpoints with federal clearance. Thomas was patched directly into an encrypted earpiece I wore hidden in my right ear, providing continuous real-time updates on the frozen offshore ledgers. Everything was perfectly secured. The financial guillotine had completely severed Harrison from his empire, and the heavy blade was now resting silently at the absolute bottom of its track. All that was left was the public execution, through a narrow slit in the thick velvet drapes. I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the primary VIP table situated directly in front of the main stage. My heart physically ached as my eyes locked onto Maya. She was sitting completely still, wearing a stunning floor-length emerald gown that she had designed herself, but she looked like an absolute ghost. Her beautiful face was terrifyingly pale, completely devoid of any natural color or life. Her eyes were swollen and red, staring blankly at the untouched plate of expensive food sitting in front of her. She was actively trembling, clutching a delicate silk handkerchief in her lap and fighting back silent, agonizing tears. She genuinely believed that I was dead. She believed that her stubborn blue-collar father had tragically drowned in a violent tropical storm off the coast of Florida just a few days ago. The profound weight of that fabricated grief was physically crushing her. And worse, she still firmly believed that she was solely responsible for a catastrophic financial failure that was about to destroy her husband's life. She was sitting in a room full of people celebrating her brand, feeling like the absolute worst daughter and the most incompetent wife in the entire world. It took every single ounce of my immense willpower not to tear through those velvet curtains right then and pull her into a tight, protective embrace. But I had to hold my ground. I had to let the monster walk directly into the blinding spotlight before I burned his world to ash. The low ambient hum of wealthy conversation suddenly quieted as the massive overhead lights dimmed. A soft, elegant spotlight illuminated the center of the grand stage. The classical string quartet that had been playing in the corner smoothly faded out their music. A sharp, well-dressed master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone and proudly introduced the Chief Executive Officer of Croft Enterprises, the man of the hour, Harrison Croft. The grand ballroom erupted into thunderous, polite applause. Harrison stepped out from the side stage and walked toward the wooden podium. He looked absolutely magnificent, a picture-perfect image of modern corporate royalty. He wore a flawless, custom-tailored tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His hair was impeccably styled, and his posture radiated a supreme, untouchable confidence. He paused at the microphone, looking out over the sea of wealthy faces, and offered a modest, deeply appreciative smile. He raised his hands gently, waiting for the loud applause to completely die down before he leaned into the microphone. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," Harrison began, his voice resonating through the high-quality ballroom speakers with a smooth, captivating baritone. "Thank you all so incredibly much for joining us tonight to celebrate this massive milestone. 3 years ago, this fashion brand was nothing more than a beautiful dream. Today, it stands as a shining testament to relentless hard work, agile corporate innovation, and the absolute power of family." He paused, letting the profound, manufactured sincerity of his words hang heavily in the silent room. He then lowered his head expertly, allowing his shoulders to slump just a fraction of an inch, perfectly simulating the heavy physical toll of profound grief. He took a slow, visibly shaky breath, a masterful theatrical performance designed to extract maximum sympathy from the elite crowd. "As many of you know, this week has brought an unimaginable, catastrophic tragedy to our family," Harrison continued, his voice cracking with absolute, calculated perfection. "We lost my wonderful father-in-law, Richard, in a devastating maritime accident off the coast of Florida. Richard was a brilliant, hard-working man. He was the sturdy, foundational bedrock of our family. He believed so fiercely in this company, and he believed so fiercely in the American dream. Losing him so suddenly, and in such a violent, terrifying storm, has completely shattered our hearts into a million pieces." A collective, sympathetic murmur rippled through the grand ballroom. Wealthy socialites placed their hands over their hearts, whispering soft condolences to one another. I watched Harrison reach into his tuxedo pocket, pull out a crisp white square of linen, and gently dab at the corner of his dry eye. It was genuinely sickening. He was actively utilizing my fabricated death to build a deeply sympathetic narrative, ensuring that when the company miraculously filed for bankruptcy in a few days, the business world would simply view it as the tragic, unavoidable collapse of a grieving family. He was milking my corpse for absolute maximum public relations value while silently mocking me in his own mind. Harrison slowly lowered the linen square and turned his dark, predatory eyes directly toward the front table. He looked down at my weeping daughter with an expression of such pure, manufactured devotion that it made my stomach violently churn. Rachel was sitting just 2 seats away, watching him with an adoring, triumphant smile. But despite this profound darkness, we must continue to find the light. Harrison whispered passionately into the microphone. I want to dedicate this beautiful night entirely to my incredibly brave, brilliant wife, Maya. Darling, your father would be so unbelievably proud of the empire you have built. I promise you, in front of all these wonderful people, that I will never stop fighting to protect your beautiful dream. The entire ballroom instantly erupted into a massive standing ovation. The applause echoed like thunder. The syndicate watchers nodded in quiet approval. Harrison Croft raised his champagne glass to the sparkling chandeliers, basking entirely in the radiant glow of his absolute flawless victory. He was completely untouchable. I looked at Director Thorne. He gave me a single firm, silent nod, signaling that his agents were perfectly positioned at every exit. I reached my hands forward, aggressively gripping the heavy fabric of the thick velvet curtain and taking one final grounding breath. It was finally time to resurrect the dead and unleash absolute, unadulterated hell. I pushed the thick fabric aside and stepped out of the shadows, walking purposefully toward the massive mahogany double doors that led directly onto the main ballroom floor. I pushed the heavy brass handles with both hands. The doors swung open with a resounding, echoing thud that cut sharply through the polite applause of the Chicago elite. I stepped fully into the blinding crystalline light of the chandeliers. I was not wearing the damp, ragged clothes of a man who had drowned in a tropical storm at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. I was wearing a sharp, custom-tailored black suit, my posture perfectly straight, my expression carved from absolute stone. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my polished shoes clicking rhythmically against the pristine marble floor. The audience at the back of the room noticed me first. The polite applause began to falter, rippling into a confused, spreading silence. People parted instantly, clearing a wide path for me as I marched directly toward the illuminated stage. Harrison was still standing at the wooden podium, his champagne glass raised high in the air, a picture of flawless corporate grief. It took him exactly 5 seconds to register the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. He slowly lowered his glass, his dark eyes scanning the crowd, trying to locate the source of the disruption. And then his gaze locked directly onto mine. The arrogant, triumphant smile on his face did not just fade. It entirely collapsed, shattering into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Harrison physically staggered backward, violently bumping into the heavy wooden podium. The microphone slipped right out of his trembling fingers, hitting the polished stage floor with a deafening, high-pitched screech of electronic feedback. The harsh noise caused several guests in the front row to cover their ears, but my eyes remained entirely fixed on the monster. All the color drained instantly from Harrison's face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He looked exactly like a man who had just seen a ghost, which in his meticulously calculated mind was exactly what I was supposed to be. To his immediate left, Rachel let out a loud, strangled gasp that echoed clearly in the sudden dead silence of the grand ballroom. She stumbled blindly backward in her designer heels, her back slamming hard into a catering table, sending a tower of crystal champagne flutes crashing violently to the floor. The sound of shattering glass amplified the mounting panic, but the most heartbreaking reaction came from my daughter. Maya slowly stood up from the front VIP table, her emerald gown catching the stage lights. She stared at me, her red, swollen eyes wide with total disbelief. Her hands covered her mouth as she let out a trembling, heartbroken sob, unsure if the grief had finally driven her completely insane. I offered her a single reassuring glance, a silent promise that the nightmare was finally coming to an end. But I did not stop walking. I bypassed the main stage entirely and marched directly toward the elevated audio-visual control booth situated on the right side of the massive ballroom. The hired disc jockey stood frozen behind his complex soundboard, completely bewildered by the unfolding chaos. I stepped up into the booth, locking eyes with the young man. "Step away from the console," I instructed, my voice calm, but carrying an undeniable heavy authority. The disc jockey did not hesitate for a single second. He immediately raised his hands and backed away, giving me total access to the primary sound system. I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my encrypted mobile device. I quickly located the main auxiliary input cable resting on the mixing board. I unplugged the connection to the venue's background music and firmly plugged the heavy jack directly into my phone. I tapped the screen, loading the enhanced compressed digital audio file that Thomas had meticulously cleaned for me. I pushed the master volume slider all the way up to the absolute maximum limit. I pressed play. The pristine, crystal-clear recording of Harrison's deep, arrogant voice instantly boomed through the massive concert speakers, filling every single corner of the silent, cavernous ballroom. "Hi is not coming back," the recorded voice of Harrison laughed darkly, the sinister sound washing over the horrified crowd of investors and socialites. "That boat rental I bought him. The mechanic is on my payroll. They severed the fuel line and rigged the bilge pump. He is going to break down in the Gulf, and a storm is rolling in this weekend. He will drown. And the best part, I forged Maya's signature to take out a $2 million life insurance policy on him. We use his death money to pay off the final syndicate boss, and Maya goes to jail. We win it all." The recording ended, leaving the ballroom in a state of absolute paralyzing shock. The sheer unvarnished evil of his confession hung heavily in the freezing air. A collective gasp of sheer horror rippled through the elite crowd. Investors began backing away from the stage in absolute disgust. The syndicate watchers standing near the exits suddenly moved their hands, reaching inside their jackets, furious that Harrison had planned to steal their $15 million. But they never got the chance to intervene. Harrison completely panicked. The realization that his entire criminal empire had just been publicly incinerated finally broke his paralyzed state. He violently shoved the wooden podium aside and sprinted frantically toward the rear service exit behind the main stage. He did not even look back at Rachel, who was currently sobbing hysterically on the floor among the broken crystal. He was a coward running for his miserable life. The moment Harrison moved, the grand ballroom doors burst wide open. Director Thorne and a heavily armed tactical team of federal agents flooded into the room, their dark tactical gear contrasting sharply with the glittering evening wear of the guests. "Federal agents. Nobody move." Thorne commanded, his voice slicing through the rising chaos. Two agents effortlessly intercepted Harrison before he even reached the velvet curtains, slamming him hard against the stage floor and pinning his arms behind his back. I picked up the spare microphone resting on the DJ console and looked directly down at the pathetic, trembling man who had tried to murder me. "You rented the wrong boat, Harrison," I said smoothly into the microphone, my voice echoing like thunder across the silent room. "You forgot your father-in-law spent 40 years building heavy machinery. I know the smell of a severed fuel line from a mile away." The heavy steel handcuffs clicked loudly around his wrists, signaling the absolute, undeniable end of his reign of terror. Rachel was aggressively pulled to her feet by a female agent, her wrists quickly bound behind her back in front of the entire elite society. The cruel financial predators had finally met their permanent match tonight. The glittering ballroom, previously filled with the bustling noise of the Chicago elite, was now a frozen tableau of sheer disbelief. The wealthy investors and influential socialites stared in absolute silence as the heavily armed federal agents marched Harrison and Rachel firmly out the rear service exit. The menacing syndicate watchers who had been lurking near the doors quietly melted away into the shadows, realizing their massive investment had just been intercepted by the federal government. I slowly stepped down from the elevated audio-visual control booth, keeping my gaze locked entirely on my daughter. Maya was standing completely alone near the front stage, her stunning emerald gown trembling violently as she struggled to comprehend the monumental deception that had just imploded in front of her. She looked incredibly fragile, like a woman waking up from a deeply traumatizing nightmare, only to find the reality was infinitely worse. I walked across the polished marble floor, navigating through the scattered shards of broken crystal champagne flutes, until I stood directly in front of her. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of us spoke a single word. Maya stared at my face, her red, swollen eyes searching my weathered features, as if she needed absolute physical proof that I was truly alive and not just a cruel hallucination. Then the immense, suffocating weight of the past 3 years finally broke her. Her knees buckled entirely and she collapsed forward. I caught her instantly, wrapping my strong arms tightly around her shoulders and pulling her into a fierce, deeply protective embrace. She buried her face into the lapel of my black suit, sobbing with a raw, guttural intensity that echoed through the silent ballroom. "Dad, I am so unbelievably sorry," she wept, her voice muffled by the thick fabric of my jacket. "I was so completely blind. I let him manipulate me. I almost let him kill you." I held her even tighter, resting my chin gently against the top of her head. "You have absolutely nothing to apologize for, sweetheart," I whispered softly. Ensuring my voice was a steady, calming anchor in her violent storm. "Your only crime was possessing a good, trusting heart and falling in love with a highly calculating monster. He systematically weaponized your ambition and your kindness. But you are completely safe now. I am right here, and I promise you that I will always protect you." The subsequent legal fallout was swift, brutal, and entirely devastating for the man who had thought he was a corporate king. Harrison was immediately denied bail. He was facing 30 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for massive wire fraud, international embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit premeditated murder. The mountain of irrefutable evidence Thomas had compiled, combined with the pristine audio recordings from the air vents, made any defense absolutely impossible. His highly paid lawyers abandoned his case the moment they realized his offshore accounts were permanently frozen by the Department of Justice. But a lengthy prison sentence was actually the least of his immediate worries. The violent Eastern European syndicate quickly realized that Harrison had intentionally attempted to steal their $15 million and flee to Europe. That profound betrayal marked him permanently. How was a dead man walking the very second he stepped inside the prison walls, forced to spend every remaining day of his miserable life looking over his shoulder in absolute terror. As for Maya, she was entirely cleared of all pending criminal charges within the first week of the federal investigation. Director Thorne personally ensured that the prosecutors reviewed the hidden liability clauses and the extensive documentation of coercive control. The federal authorities quickly recognized that she was a deeply traumatized victim of severe psychological manipulation and systemic forgery, not a willing accomplice to a financial crime ring. She did not owe a single cent to the international creditors, and the heavy legal burden that had been slowly crushing her soul was permanently lifted. The fake fashion empire was dissolved into bankruptcy, stripped down, and sold for parts to repay the outstanding domestic vendors. We walked away from that toxic corporate illusion completely clean, holding our heads incredibly high. 1 year has officially passed since that chaotic night in the grand ballroom. The profound healing process was long and deeply emotional, requiring intense therapy and a complete reconstruction of her shattered confidence. However, my daughter is incredibly resilient. Today, Maya and I stood proudly together on a quiet, sunlit street corner in a lovely suburban neighborhood, smiling brightly as we officially cut the red ribbon on her brand new, entirely authentic clothing boutique. There are absolutely no fake luxury materials here. There are no highly toxic corporate investors demanding impossible margins. There are no shady shell companies hiding dark secrets in offshore accounts. It is just an honest, transparent, and beautifully run small business. I even built the sturdy wooden display racks and installed the commercial security cameras myself. We work happily side by side every single day, rebuilding a quiet, peaceful life grounded in profound mutual respect and genuine affection. Sometimes protecting the people you truly love means you have to be willing to aggressively burn the surrounding forest to the absolute ground just to completely destroy the wolves hiding in the thick shadows. I permanently lost the $500,000 I initially invested, but that stolen money means absolutely nothing to me right now. I successfully kept my own life, and I successfully rescued my brilliant daughter from a terrifying, highly calculated corporate predator who viewed her as disposable. Those arrogant, heavily manipulative men who foolishly think they can easily deceive and completely destroy an aging, retired, blue-collar father often make one massive, completely fatal miscalculation. They completely forget that in order to survive in this unpredictable world, for over 70 hard years, we have already had to relentlessly hunt and permanently dismantle monsters far more ruthless and dangerous than them. It is the ultimate truth. We do not break when the pressure builds. We simply wait in the dark, gathering our tools, evaluating the structural weaknesses of our enemies, and then we strike with absolute devastating precision. My beautiful daughter is absolutely safe. My heavy conscience is completely clear, and the monster is completely and permanently locked away forever now. There is a dangerous misconception that family is defined merely by marriage certificates or polite smiles at holiday dinners. True family is forged in the fires of honesty, respect, and mutual protection. When predators infiltrate your life wearing the mask of a loved one, they rely on your silence and your willingness to keep the peace. Do not give them that power. Never ignore the quiet alarms your intuition sounds. Standing up to abuse, even when it means tearing down your own world, is not an act of destruction. It is the ultimate act of survival and truly profound love. Did this story resonate with you? Have you ever had to trust your gut to uncover a painful truth about someone close? Share your experiences in the comments below. If you want more stories of justice and survival, hit that subscribe button and leave a like. Stay strong, my friend.